Wonderful attendance on a Thursday afternoon. We will call the Senate Regulated Industries and Utilities Committee meeting to order. Senator Gooch, our majority whip, has a bill for us today. We're going to have a hearing only, and it should be in your folders. I certainly think we got everything lined up here along with some educational materials to keep us educated. We're going to be today looking at SB 65 on the public utilities and public transportation funding issues for some of this broadband expansion. Senator Gooch, I'm going to give you the floor to explain your bill, and you're welcome to sit where you are if that's more comfortable. I'll light your mic up so the audience, I know you got quite a few fans out there listening in, can hear what you got to say. We do have 6 or 7 speakers lined up, sure. And so I think we're going to have time to get everybody to talk, and please stay lively. We'll keep Senator Lucas awake this afternoon before he drives back down to Macon.
We do not want the senator to fall asleep during this presentation.
It's going to be on you if he does, so let's have it.
Well, first let me thank you for allowing me to present this important legislation. And I'm not wearing my EMC badge today, so this legislation.
You must have got what you needed there. Okay, he's taking the EMC face mask off.
But I would like to congratulate the wisdom of this committee for passing some of the best legislation that this Senate has passed in decades. Senate Bill 2 has truly turned out to be a game changer. SB 402 and of course, your bill last year is helping us to move the needle in broadband. But seriously, this does not have a thing to do with the EMCs. We have been searching for opportunities, as you know, Chairman Calzert, to help find the funding to help fix the problems in rural Georgia. And they're not just in rural Georgia. There's pockets of unserved areas in Atlanta. And so there's a lot of opportunities in this bill. I believe if we can get the industry folks that are waiting to testify, most of them will probably testify they have issues with the bill, and I understand that. The best way to get that conversation going is to introduce a bill, get the parties to the table, and work out a compromise. So we're not going to vote on anything here today, but what I would like to see happen today is that we continue working with the industry, with you, Chairman Calzert, and anyone else to look for a solution to this funding. Now, the Universal Access Fund is one of the most complicated things I have sunk my teeth into recently, and you will be hearing from Patrick Reinhardt shortly. He works with the PSC, and he has a better grasp of it, and he can explain it. And I think there's some slide presentations in your material in your folder as well. But currently, there's a Universal Access Fund, and what that is if you ever look at your bills for your telephone service at home, you will see at least 6 or 7 different fees, charges, service fees. They range from federal, FCC, 911, Georgia, hearing impaired, a paper bill charge. I pay 50 cents every month just so I can touch my paper statement. A deregulated administration fee. In this month's bill of my current phone at home, my phone bill and my cable bill was $144.68. 25% of that were for some kind of fees or surcharges that we're paying either to the state, local, or federal government. So I'm not here to ask for a new tax to be put on the internet. That is not the intention. But the Georgia Universal Access Fee, portions of it are going to sunset June 30th of this year. There's basically 2 buckets that come from the Georgia Universal Access Fee, and Patrick will explain that shortly. One of those buckets has a sunset of June 30th of this year. The other bucket sunsets in the end of the decade, basically in 2030. And there's not a rate that we've assessed in any legislation here. The rate that is assessed is done by the PSC, and they assess that rate on every phone in Georgia, every landline, based on the revenue of the companies who apply for the monies. Now, there's roughly there's 34 local exchange companies that can qualify for some of this money, but over 200 companies in Georgia are paying into the fund. And so with only 34 people receiving it, people meaning entities, over 200 are paying into it. AT&T is the largest. They're the tier 1 company. They're charging this same universal service fee to all of their customers, but they do not qualify for any of the money. So that's current law. So they would love to see this whole thing go away. And I'm satisfied Kevin will tell you that when he comes in. What we would like to do is repurpose this portion of the grant or the portion of the fund that sunsets June 30th and develop it into a broadband deployment fund. So it would continue to operate and function similar to what's going on today, except it would open up the opportunities for all of the internet providers and telephone providers to have access to the fund. More people would be able to utilize that money to deploy their broadband in the unserved areas, and that's key. The unserved areas is defined as was put in SB 402 a couple of years ago, to where you would have to bring the level of service up to 25.3 in speeds. And so those maps are now current, they're now accurate, they're being managed by the Department of Community Affairs. So the PSC would manage this program. The phone companies and the internet companies would provide the revenue to it, but they would all apply for the funding on a needs basis, and the PSC would then have to determine, based on the criteria set forth in their rules, who would qualify based on the best return on the investment being put forth. So it's a lot of information to go over. I wanted to give you just a 30,000-foot overview. I think at this point it would be easier if we listened to Patrick explain the current UAF fee and then talk about how it would be implemented if this bill were to pass. And then at your pleasure, we can take some critique from the industry folks. What I would love to hear them say is what they would like to see this fund be developed into, other than just letting it sunset and go away. I understand that may be their first preference, but if we're going to get serious about solving the problem, we've got to continue to look for funding. $20 million in this budget we passed today is a good start, but we need to continue to put more and more and more every year into this budget until this problem's solved. If we can do this for 5 years, I think it would be a home run. The current bill allows it to run for 10, but obviously that's up to the discretion of this committee. So I'll stop at that point in the interest of time and move in your direction.
Did you tell us here, do you know exactly what kind of dollars we're talking about, what this is generating on an annual basis?
Good question. So if you look at what currently is being leveraged, we'll start back in 2011, which is when the fund was created. So the Access Transition Fund is the one that Trent did, is the one that's going to sunset June 30th. It originally started out in 2011 generating $5.6 million, and it has increased pretty much every year with the exception of 2 years. Last year it was $18 million. The highest year that revenues were collected was in 2015, which was $23,627,000, and that's derived as a result of the applications that are turned in by these companies. They're called ILECs and CLECs. The companies turn the applications in asking for the money, and then the PSC has to determine what rate to charge on our phone bills. Currently, that is set by the PSC at 6%. So it's based on a revenue, not a charge per phone line. So it's 6% of your phone bill is how they calculated that fee. Over on the other bucket of money is called the High Cost Fund, which doesn't sunset until 2030. It originally started in 2011 at $16 million a year. This year it's set to collect $32,196,000. So between the High Cost Fund and the Access Transition Fund, we're talking roughly $50 million.
And that's an annual number?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, well, we have Patrick Reinhardt and Tom Bond from Georgia Public Service Commission here by Zoom, and I hope everybody will be able to see this and I can somehow work the microphone so we can hear them talk. Mr. Reinhardt, if you would educate us a little bit.
All right, thank you. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, I thank you for the opportunity to present to you about the Universal Access Fund. My name is Patrick Reinhardt. I'm an engineer with the Telecom unit of the Public Service Commission, and I'm joined by Tom Bond, who's the director of the Utilities Division of the Public Service Commission. And I'm going to attempt to share my screen here with you.
That's
All right,
working
very
good for
good.
us.
So first, I just wanted to give you a very brief overview of the PSC Telecom unit, who we are and what we do. There are 5 members of the unit. The director is Leon Bowles, and we also have 3 analysts, Dorothy Buckner, Tanika Starks, Erica Wilson, and I'm Patrick Reinhardt, as I've said. So very small staff, and we have quite a few functions and responsibilities. Obviously, the Universal Access Fund is one we're going to talk about today. We also manage another multi-million-dollar fund called the Telecommunications Relay Service. This is a service for the deaf and hard of hearing, as well as the speech impaired. It includes the relay service as well as caption telephone service. There's a separate program for equipment distribution, and then there's a hearing aid program for low-income adults and children. We also review applications for designation as eligible telecommunications carriers. ETCs are carriers that are eligible to receive federal funds, but they have to apply to the state to receive those funds. Some of them are primarily Lifeline discounted service providers. So you may be aware of SafeLink or Assurance Wireless. Telrite is another company that does that. Recently, in the last 2 months, we've received about 15 applications from companies that were awarded Rural Digital Opportunity Fund grants from the FCC. And we're working our way through those applications now to ensure that Georgia gets all the funding that's due to it for these valuable services. We also reviewed dozens and dozens of applications for certificates of authority each year. These include competitive local exchange carriers, inter-exchange carriers, alternate operator services, resellers of long distance, inmate telephone services, which is Prism phone service, telephone service observing equipment, licenses, and automatic dialing and announcing devices. The first 5 of that list contribute to the Universal Access Fund, and we'll get into that a little bit later. We review applications for financing authority and transfers of control. We handle numbering administration for the state, and this is to ensure that our numbering resources are not used up too quickly. As you may know, the 404, 770, 678, 470 area codes for the city of Atlanta or the Atlanta metro area are about to exhaust, and the commission recently approved an overlay area code for the metro area. Unfortunately, we didn't get to choose that number ourselves, so it's going to be 943. You'll be seeing that in the coming months. We also review EMC cost allocation manuals. This came out of Senate Bill 2. And of course, EMC poll attachments as a result of House Bill 244. We had a whirlwind cost docket last year on that. So with apologies to the late Stephen Hawking, I've entitled this section A Brief History of the UAF. So the story of the UAF really begins with the Telecommunications and Competition Development Act of 1995. This preceded by 1 year the Federal Telecommunications Act of 1996. And what it was intended to do was introduce competition into the local service market. So it did 3 big things. The first one is that it allowed existing rate-regulated local telephone service providers to elect alternative regulation. So rate-regulated telephone providers have their rates set by the Public Service Commission. Companies that elect alternative regulation can largely set their own rates, but they are not guaranteed any rate of return on that. That's sort of the trade-off between being regulated by the PSC and being alternatively regulated. The second thing that it did was it allowed competitive telephone service providers to enter the local exchange market for the first time. And finally, it created the UAF, which allows rural telephone companies to recover operational losses in high-cost areas. So let's go over some definitions real quick. What are incumbent local exchange carriers? These are carriers that prior to the passage of the 1995 Act were monopoly service providers with defined non-overlapping service territories. And again, their rates were set by the PSC. These companies cannot refuse any reasonable request for basic local exchange service. That's also known as carrier of last resort obligations. And there are currently 35 ILECs in Georgia. The largest ones as Senator Gooch said, AT&T Georgia, Windstream, TDS, CenturyLink, Frontier. There are also lots of smaller independent ones, Public Service Telephone Company, Ringgold Telephone Company, Chickamauga Telephone Company. And there are several nonprofit co-ops that provide phone service in Georgia. Pineland, Progressive Rural, Bullock Telephone Cooperative are some examples of those. On the other hand, we have competitive local exchange carriers. These are carriers that may provide service in any or all parts of the state. Their rates are largely not set by the Public Service Commission, with a few very minor exceptions. They have no carrier of last resort obligations like their ILEC counterparts do. And we currently have 208 CLECs in Georgia that are active. Some examples of those are Comcast, Verizon, Deltacom. A number of cities hold certificates to provide competitive local exchange service. A number of ILECs have affiliates that are CLECs. And this is a map I pulled from the Georgia Telecommunications Association website. You can see the URL in the bottom right corner. And this just shows what I was talking about in the previous slide, the defined service territories of the ILECs in Georgia. In the light green, you can see AT&T Georgia, formerly known as Bell South. The dark green is Windstream. There are actually 6 companies that make up Windstream, but they're all represented in the same dark green color. And then you can see the other colors represent the other ILECs in Georgia. And if you go to that link, you can match up the numbers to the company names and see who's who. So the next chapter of the UAF was written in 2010, and that's the Telecom Jobs and Investment Act, also known as House Bill 168. And this, much like the 95 Act, did 3 kind of big things. First, it required CLECs and ILECs to reduce access charges. Access charges are the rates that telephone companies charge each other. And many of the rural ILECs in particular had very, very high access rates, multiple cents per minute to originate and terminate calls. And the effect of this was that long distance calls within the state of Georgia often were more expensive than a long distance call to Florida or California or New York. So the goal here was to bring down the charges that carriers charge each other, and then you bring down long distance rates as a result. But again, as I said, this is was a significant revenue source for the rural ILECs in Georgia. So the second big thing that House Bill 168 did was it required those rural ILECs to increase their local service rates to a statewide benchmark rate. And we'll get into that a little bit later. But the idea here was you have one revenue source going away. So you have to give these companies another revenue source, and you want to have them recover more of that revenue from their end users rather than from other telephone service providers. And then the third thing that HB 168 did was it split the UAF into 2 sub-funds. The first one we call the High Cost Fund, and the second one is the Access Transition Fund. You won't see either of these terms in the law or in the bill. This is just what we refer to them internally. But you can find that at 46.5.167 D2A and B. So the first sub-fund is what we call the High Cost Fund. And it operates much like the 1995 version of the UAF. It allows certain carriers to recover operating losses in high-cost areas. However, funding is limited to rate-regulated ILECs. Again, ILECs, the commission sets their rates, and that is 20 out of the 35 ILECs in Georgia that are eligible to receive funding under the High Cost Fund. And that fund sunsets after 20 years, and 2030 will be the last year. The funding will go to 0 in 2031. The second sub-fund is the Access Transition Fund. And as previously stated, under HB 168, rural ILECs were required to decrease their access charges, the rates they charge each other, to interstate levels, and increase local service rates to a statewide benchmark determined by the PSC. And then any shortage in the revenue between the reduction in access charges and the increase in local service rates is recoverable from the Access Transition Fund. And 34 of the 35 ILECs in Georgia were eligible to receive funds. The one that was not, as Senator Gooch said, is AT&T Georgia. And this fund sunsets after 10 years, which this year is when it goes to zero. So what's the Commission's role in the UAF? Well, starting with the High Cost Fund, the Commission first determines the filing requirements needed to make an application for disbursements. The Commission sets a rate of return. It's currently at 8%, capped at 8%. Other policies, the Commission determines other policies to ensure that the fund only reimburses applicants for the reasonable actual costs of providing basic local exchange services. So the Commission has certain policies like limits on executive compensation. It doesn't prevent companies from paying their executives whatever they want. They just can't run it through the UAF. Every application every year is audited by an auditor selected by the Commission to ensure compliance with the law and Commission regulations. And it's in fact, it's so granular that the auditor reviews all expenses greater than $250. On the Access Transition Fund side, there are multiple steps in this. First, the Commission had to calculate a statewide average local service rate. In 2011, that was $18.54. And you can think of this as sort of a target rate. Again, the bill was trying to get the rural ILECs to recover more of their costs from their end users. So some of these companies hadn't had a rate increase or rate case in over a decade. And there were some that had rates as low as $6 and change. So they had a long way to go to get up to the 1854 statewide rate. HB 168 required the Commission to set a schedule upon which all of those carriers would reach that rate. The Commission chose a 9-year period, and I'm happy to say that now all of the ILECs in Georgia are up to the 2151 rate, and that's adjusted for inflation. So it's it was kind of a moving target. Each year the Commission had to raise that benchmark rate. And then finally, the Commission determined disbursements from the fund by subtracting the local service rate increases from the access revenue loss. And next, how is the UAF funded? Well, 465167B says that all telecommunications companies holding a certificate of authority issued by the Commission to provide services within Georgia shall contribute quarterly to the fund. The Commission determines the required funding based on the applications that we received for high cost fund support and previously for projections for the Access Transition Fund support. The Commission then sets a factor to be applied to the intra-state revenues of telecommunications companies, and that's currently set at 6%. And under state law, carriers are permitted to put a pass-through surcharge on customer bills to collect this funding. And as Senator Gooch touched on earlier, funding from the UAF is shown here. And you can see in blue, the Access Transition Fund started around $6 million, peaked in 2015. And that was actually the point where access rates hit the interstate level, the lowest level that they had been. And you can see it starts tapering off and then it goes to zero in 2021. And the high cost fund after House Bill 168 was passed started around 16 million. It's fluctuated, but generally it has an upward trajectory, and the most recent applications that were filed total around $32 million. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions that you may have.
I've got a basic one. I got a little confused. Who sets the rate of the tax? It sounds like that fluctuates based upon the applications for need.
Yes, that's correct. So we have to estimate a little bit. The applications come in December, so we know what they're asking for, and we know that's probably the maximum amount that they're going to get. And then we look at the amount of money that has been coming in previous quarters, and we can sort of back into how much intrastate telecommunications revenue there is. And then we set a new rate based on the amount that we expect that we're going to need to fund.
Okay. So this is a very unique creature then. You're basically setting a tax rate. We've given the PSC the ability to set a tax rate based upon need. Y'all might want to call it a fee rate, but, you know, it's not quibble.
We call it an assessment, I think.
Probably. So am I right that rate, we just heard 6%, that fluctuates from year to year, or it can?
It can. We recently changed it in the last quarter of 2020. I believe the previous rate had been in effect for a couple of years. If it's enough to fund it, we don't change it. We try not to keep a significant balance in the accounts. We shoot for around $1 million, so we're not sitting on a ton of money in our UAF accounts.
Okay. And did we expect that all the applicants' needs would have been met before this fee expired this year? Sounds like they're continuing to ask for additional money.
Yeah, I mean, each year they file, new applications based on their previous year, how they did.
Is that covering their operating cost, or is it also covering their capital build-out cost?
Right. So it's the entire operation, and it's on a fiscal year basis in arrears. So the current applications that were filed in December were based on the July 2019 to June 30th, 2020 fiscal period.
Okay. So what happens to these ILECs and CLECs when this fee expires and they can no longer access the fund through the application process? If we don't do anything to this bill and it sunsets, or how are they going to fill that need in the future?
My guess is that they would re-elect alternative regulation, or elect alternative regulation, and then they would set their own rates.
So you could be having a situation where this poor people out in the rural areas that already don't have broadband are about to get their telephone rates jacked up to make up for these operating costs?
That could be the result of that, yes.
Okay. All right. All right. That's you are quite informative to us today. We appreciate you being here. I imagine we got some other committee members that may have questions. In fact, Senator Tippins, the higher education chairman, trying to get rural broadband out to those colleges, has a question.
Absolutely. Thank you for participating. Do I read the bill correctly that the Universal Access Fund is only levied against what we would term a landline?
Yes, so it's all intrastate telecommunications services. So that would include, landline services, vertical features, that sort of thing, business services, but no broadband, no video services, anything like that. Long distance services within the state of Georgia would count in that.
Just an observation. In passing, it looks to me like the number of landlines are decreasing because so many people have gone to cell phones, and you almost have a disproportionate levy against the people who are forced to have landlines because they don't have telephone service, cell phone service. Why wouldn't cell phones be taxed in this? I mean, you're talking about. Pardon? No, go ahead. I mean, you're talking about a decreasing pool of people that are paying to expand broadband. You're increasing telecommunications and digital technology. I don't understand why we don't tax cellular phones as well. I mean, basically the people who had cellular phones when they first came out, I remember paying 35 cents a minute to talk on it, but it was those higher rates that put cheap telephone service in everybody's reach, and I think the same principle will be applicable in this. I think you go.
Well, I don't know that that's a question. I think it's a speech so far, but when we get to it, we'll get there.
Well, is it not true that this is solely paid for by landlines?
Senator Gooch,
Yeah.
since it's your bill, we're going to let you chime in and let Patrick off the hook on that one for a minute.
Patrick can help clarify what I say, whether it's correct or not, but it's one of the reasons we want this bill. If we're going to continue to collect on the landlines, you're right. It would be a declining revenue if it were a fixed price per landline, but it's not a fixed price per landline. He just explained they calculate a rate based on the request for the money to operate some of these high-cost areas. So whenever some of these companies come in later today to testify, we should ask them what their landline subscription numbers look like, because I think you're going to find they have declined. So part of the bill is to go away from that model, get rid of this access transition line or fund, and do a broadband deployment fund, which would include the internet subscribers, not the landline subscribers, but people who are hooked onto a cable, whether it's fiber, copper, or what have you, getting internet service to their home. Then that fee would apply to them, and it would broaden the number of people paying into the fund to where the PSC could then lower the rate possibly to 1 or 2% or 3%, whatever the number has to be. And that number does fluctuate, because once we get to the point to where the problem's solved, it should be zero. But if we continue to fund this program, you're just going to continue to help pay for the operation of some of these smaller telephone companies who, by the way, have some of the best internet service in the state of Georgia now, because they've been able to use some of this funding. And so whenever they come forward today, we'll be able to ask that question. So,
Thank you.
but you helped sell me on the bill.
I read the bill. I did not get that
Yeah.
understanding of it.
Maybe Patrick could clarify if I missed any points.
Let's move on. We don't have it now.
All right. Thank you.
Sure,
Are there additional?
I'd be happy to.
Yeah, go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah. I'm sorry.
Go right ahead.
Okay. So Senator Jeppens is correct that you have a shrinking number of landlines, to assess for this. So it's kind of, we have to keep adjusting the UAF factor in order to produce the same amount of funding for it. And as landlines decrease, then you just have to keep adjusting. But the way I understand Senate Bill 65 is written is it would assess this on both intrastate telecommunications services and broadband services. So it would expand the base upon which the factor would apply.
Okay. Are there other questions from committee members? I do note that we have perfect attendance -1 who I excused to attend his daughter's birthday party down in Columbus this evening. My Vice Chairman, Senator Brass, you're recognized for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Patrick, quick question. I'm looking at Senator Gooch's phone bill here, and for whatever month this was, January, the Universal Access Fund was at $1.86. So it would stay that $1.86 for the whole year of 2021? Is that how it works, or does it adjust monthly, or does it adjust yearly?
It adjusts whenever the commission adjusts it, and it's on a quarterly basis. So the commission, like I said, in the fourth quarter of 2020, increased it from 4.9% to 6%, and that was basically just to pay the final payment in the Access Transition Fund. Because that goes away, we could potentially reduce the factor for the second quarter of 2021. But yeah, it could change as often as every quarter, I guess is probably the best way to say that.
Okay, and a quick follow-up, if you'll allow,
Sure.
Mr. Chairman.
Go right ahead.
So when was the last adjustment before that fourth quarter of 2020, and what was it at that point? I'm just trying to get an idea of the fluctuation here.
I might have to go back and look on that. I believe it increased to 4.9%. I believe it was about 2 years ago was the last change.
That's good enough.
I'm not sure what it was before. It was lower than that before that, though. I can tell you that much.
Thank you.
All right, any further
You're welcome.
questions?
Thank you.
Senator Lucas, number 11.
Patrick, the universal fund was set up basically to try to do something with the rates that one in North Georgia might charge for a phone call, calling somewhere in Georgia where I could call to California for a lot less. So if we take cell phones right now, and there's a charge on for 911 for them to say that they can use it to tell you where they're getting the call from, what tower, and those kind of things. Why is it that if we can't access or either put a fee on cell phone use? Landlines are going out. Most folks are using cell phones now. Can the PSC set rates that will charge cell phone users?
No, sir. By law, it is only intrastate telecommunications services. It would require a change of law to apply that to cell phones. And you're correct. I mean, there are probably 10 times as many cell phones in the state of Georgia than there are landlines.
Well, I mean, would that be can we change state law, or is that federal law?
I believe you could change it. I'm not an attorney, I'm an engineer, so I don't want to give you legal advice, but I believe that is within your power to do so.
I'm going to call on Senator Albers to explain how you go about changing state law.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've got a little cartoon of how a bill becomes a law we can play later. Quick question for you. If someone were to get Comcast internet service and get a voice over IP telephone with that, do they pay into the access fund?
Yes, Comcast is actually one of our largest contributors to the UAF.
Okay. All right, thank you.
All right. Other questions?
Can I make one comment?
You can.
If you look at lines 158 on the bill, we put a cap in this program. This local exchange portion of the fund shall be limited to $35 million in any fiscal year. I was concerned about this rate continuing to go up to where it got to where it's not 5% or 6% anymore. It could go to 20% if people literally cut off their landline phones. So that's the reason for that cap, was to try to limit what the PSC could literally levy as an assessed fee. But there are some people out in the hall that are concerned that do not want the cap. So, you know, that's a negotiating point that we can have going forward if we move this bill. So,
Okay. All right. Senator Kennedy.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Patrick, I want to make sure I understand sort of from a policy standpoint, from your perspective, would it be correct to say that the purpose of the Universal Access Fund is there to compensate those phone companies? Take, I think in one of your examples, a typical small rural area telephone company where they're obligated to provide service to all customers. And because of that obligation, they naturally will have higher costs than a company that could pick and choose to whom they deliver service. And the Universal Access Fund is there for them to apply on an annual basis to offset that cost because of the higher operating cost they have for serving rural Georgia?
That's exactly right. So in a very rural area or a very high cost area, if someone built a house on the side of a mountain, these carriers are obligated to serve that customer. And that's, to provide universal access to telecommunications. That's exactly right.
And is it that fund that will last another 10 years that sunsets in 31?
Yeah, another 10 years for that fund. That's correct.
Okay.
we're not changing that other than the cap.
All right. Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you, Mr.
Job. We got a question from my wingman, Senator Ginn, down there. See if I can get your number. You 10?
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. One of the things I wanted to remind our committee members, I believe it was about 4 years ago, we changed to where service to that guy up on top of the mountain or out in the boondocks that wanted landline, we allowed the phone carriers to, instead of having to put a hard phone cable to them, to be able to provide alternative service means to them. They can do that through a cell phone service. They can provide other technologies to get that person service. I just want to make sure our committee members remember that. I want to say wasn't about 4 years ago.
That's about right, I think. Okay.
If I may, Senator Gannon, I'm sorry. I believe, again, I'm not an attorney, but my understanding of that law was that it applied to companies that did not receive money from the Universal Access Fund, which at the time would have been just AT&T, and it allowed them to provide service through other means. I don't believe that applies to these companies, the rate of return companies.
Go right ahead, Senator.
Patrick, how often is that type of service provided to a citizen of Georgia? Do you know?
Someone on top of a mountain? You mean?
Well, in a remote area that they, an alternative means versus a twisted pair.
Well, yeah, most of the carriers now don't even provide service via copper anymore. But I mean, you're right. I was providing sort of a hyperbolic, example of that. But it's hard for me to say, how many new customers are building houses in extremely remote or high cost areas.
Thank you.
Is Tom Bond there with you, Patrick? You want to turn it over to him, or do I need to hook up?
He is on Zoom, I believe.
Okay. I just didn't know if he was in the room with you, but we
He's not
have
in the
him
room
listed.
with me, but I believe he is on Zoom.
You guys do your magic on him? He's listed there, but we got him listed at the same phone number for your connection, and I don't know exactly how to hook him up. We're still learning about all this phone service and technology and such. Were you able to reach out to him and get him to call in to us?
Sorry, I'm on mute. I can text him right quick and see
All right.
if.
Well, we'll keep you guys on hold. We're going to move on down the list. Just tell him if he has more to add, that he can call us here. You let me know, and then we'll try to hook him up. I've got Bob Davis from Verizon next. We're trying to get him through Zoom as well. You guys ready to queue him up? All right.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm here.
All right, great. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Bob Davis, and I'm Vice President of State and Local Government Affairs for Verizon. Thank you for this opportunity to speak actually in opposition to SB 65. At Verizon, we know that the digital divide is a real pressing risk to society. We believe that all Americans should have access to broadband. So it is essential that we work together to find viable solutions to address gaps in broadband deployment, access, and adoption. We appreciate Senator Gooch trying to address these problems. We just don't think that SB 65 is the actually best way to go about it. Ideally, these solutions should be national in focus, since broadband is an interstate, really boundaryless service. Patrick mentioned some of this. The FCC is currently spending around $40 billion among the Connect America Fund, Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, and 5G Fund to address the digital divide. Additionally, it is currently repurposing the Federal Universal Service Fund in part for broadband purposes. But we certainly understand that leaders in Georgia do not necessarily want to wait for national solutions. If Georgia decides to move forward on funding for rural broadband, it really should come from general appropriations, as are currently being considered by the General Assembly, and not a specific tax or fee on communication services. I'm familiar with states like Tennessee, South Carolina, and North Carolina have already established rural broadband grant programs over the past several years, funded by general revenues. In fact, the New York broadband program is a real good model for other states to follow. This program offered $500 million of state appropriated funds to support broadband deployment in unserved areas of New York. New York awarded the funds using a competitive, technology-neutral auction process. So just like a couple finer points about the bill. First, the bill has no cap, as in my reading, on the new broadband fund, unlike the traditional part of the fund. It gives the Public Service Commission unfettered discretion on how much to tax communication providers and their customers in the state of Georgia. We just don't think regulators should have that much power to tax and spend. Customers in Georgia already pay 31.8% assessment on regulated interstate revenues with a federal fund. And they pay, like Patrick mentioned, an additional 6% on the Universal Access Fund. Second, the bill also proposes a fee on broadband services. We think that assessing such a fee would likely violate the Federal Internet Tax Freedom Act, which prohibits state or local charges on internet. In conclusion, Verizon doesn't believe that creating a new uncapped broadband fund paid by consumer is really the right way to resolve the digital divide. Georgia should continue on the path of creating a program derived from general revenues that, one, focuses on increased adoption where broadband is available, but also on deployment on where it's not available. Two, is consistent with FCC policy. Three, does not overlap with federally funded build-out because federal funds cannot be used if the state has already appropriated funds for certain areas. And number four, is competitively neutral and technology neutral in process. And five, uses a competitive process to award the funds. That's all I have, and I thank you for my opportunity, and certainly can take any questions.
Mr. Davis, you mentioned that the federal government prohibits taxing internet services. Would you reference that law to me again? I didn't catch the name of it.
Yeah, it's called the Internet Tax Freedom Act, and it became permanent, I believe, 2 or 3 years ago. There was continuing reenactments of the bill, but now it's permanent. So it's called the Internet Tax Freedom Act. And I can certainly provide a citation if you need to.
Does that apply to these streaming services that are so popular now?
I believe it does.
You don't think we could tax those if we wanted to?
It's certainly not the internet access piece, I know for sure. I'm not a tax expert,
Okay.
but I could certainly find out.
All right. Other members have questions for Mr. Davis? All right, Senator Gooch.
Hey, Bob, it's good to see you again.
Good to see you, Senator.
How many landline customers do you think Verizon has in Georgia? Do you have that number?
You know, Verizon has landline customers through its, affiliate MCI, which folks remember from the purchase probably since 2005. I would say, Senator, it's probably less than 10,000 between small business and just residential customers.
And how about cable? Any cable customers or internet?
No cable
providers?
customers.
Okay. So this bill doesn't touch your wireless services. You understand that, obviously.
Correct. That's how I read it.
So it would basically impact your 10,000 landline customers in the state.
Correct.
Okay. Thank you.
And well, to the extent that you do, I mentioned the Internet Tax Freedom Act. To the extent you ban, we do provide broadband services. So that's through our certainly wireless affiliate, but also through MCI. So
Right.
it would put a tax on that.
So your customers are currently paying the Georgia Universal Access fee on their phone bill that you mail them each month?
On the MCI communication services bill, correct?
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, and we'll now have Mr. Brent Beal from Lumen Technologies.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. I'm Brent Beal from Lumen Technologies. Had a chance to sit down with Senator Gooch earlier this week, I guess. It all runs together at this point. Some of you may not be as familiar with Lumen Technologies. We're formerly CenturyLink, as Patrick had mentioned earlier. We have an ILEC and we have a CLEC in the state of Georgia. And as part of this rebranding, we've focused on fiber deployment in all over the country and all over the world. And one of the things that we've done in Georgia in the past year that you may be interested to know is we have 6,000 miles of fiber. We have 165,000 connections. And in 2020, we invested over $40 million to expand Georgia's network. We employ over 400 employees in the state of Georgia. Now, we have an ILEC in the counties of Liberty and Bryan counties outside of Savannah. And we've looked at this bill and we've looked at different ways to fix it. I promised Senator Gooch that I would sit down and I would look at different ways that we could fix this bill. We could look at it. And one of the things that we looked at and talked to my folks and looking at it is in 2021, the state is already, it's the first time that we've proposed funding the broadband grant program. We'd like to, we certainly support that. We believe that's a correct path for us to go. But we had the announcement of the 15 RDOF winners that secured $326 million that is going to go into areas of Georgia that do not have broadband. Not only that, we've had the USDA is committed earlier this year to investing $4.6 million in Georgia. And then I was there Monday when the announcement came for the partnership to spend $210 million to build broadband in Miller, Georgia. While we certainly support Senator Gooch and his endeavors to try to improve rural broadband, we think that there should be legislation that's tailored to complement and further the efforts that are already now announced. Specifically, we continue to encourage the furtherance of the broadband grant program in the state of Georgia and option of a broadband equipment tax exemption. Those are two things that we truly think could move the needle in the state of Georgia. And those are two ideas that will complement the things that are already announced. So those are things, I won't take too much time because I know you have other speakers, but those are things that we would like to see in lieu of this bill.
All right. Thank you for sharing your views. Are there any questions from committee members? Senator Miller, our pro tem.
Thank you very much for being here with us. You said there was two things, the broadband, the equipment tax exemption, and what was the first one? I didn't quite get it. I'm sorry.
Yes, sir. The broadband grant program that is looked at being funded for the first time in the state of Georgia.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
We would support the appropriation.
Thank you for being here with us today. And now we have some live testimony. We'll call on Mr. Kevin Curtin from AT&T, and Hunter Hill, you'll be on tap, on deck, I guess we'd call it, so just be ready. It is late on a Thursday afternoon. Tap's not quite yet open. We'll may have some craft beer testimony in here in a couple of weeks. Welcome, Mr. Curtin. Introduce yourself for the audiences at home and share your thoughts on Senate Bill 65.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kevin Curtin, Assistant Vice President of Legislative Affairs for AT&T. Had the pleasure of speaking with you all last week about broadband and what's going on. Would like to address the bill on the table, though, Senate Bill 65 in particular. I was going to give a lot of legislative history as to how the Universal Access Fund came to be, because I had to work on that bill for 2.5 years of my career, 2009, 2010, and I still have some scars to prove that I worked on that bill. To answer a few of the questions that were asked earlier around cell phones, the reason cell phones don't pay into the Universal Access Fund is very simple. The Universal Access Fund was designed to have companies that saved access fees and that were reduced in the 2010 reform, who saved the money, pay in. Cell phones didn't save any money in the 2010 reforms because they never paid those access fees to start with. So cell phones are sort of a different category, and that's why I just give you the history of it. First of all, like you've heard previous testimony, we do believe that broadband to everybody is very critical, and we also recognize that privately funded networks simply won't get to everybody without some help from the government. There are some very hard to reach places that are very high cost, and there is simply no current business model which will reach those folks by the private market. So there is some need for the government to assist in that regard. As we spoke about last week, there are many federal programs right now doling out substantial amounts of money. The Connect America Fund, the Rural Digital Opportunity Fund, the Reconnect program via USDA. And those are the three major categories of funding that are available to carriers today to spread broadband. As you referred to earlier, an announcement on Monday, 80,000 homes in middle Georgia by EMCs serving, that's part of the RDOF process. So they were funded through the RDOF program. So these are good things are happening from some of those federal programs, and I think you're starting to really see the needle being moved. Unfortunately, and I hate to do this because I love Senator Gooch, but we do not support Senate Bill 65. I know, it's hard to, the breakups are hard to do.
I divorced him a long time ago.
Let me give you just a simple reason why. The Universal Access Fund was set up for a very specific purpose, and especially the access reform part of the fund was set up for a very, very specific purpose. And let me tell you why it was set up. It didn't exist before 2010. The reason it exists today is because back in 2010, some of the rural telephone companies were charging access charges, which let me explain what access charges are. Access charges are what I have to pay to connect the phone call on the local side of the call. When, let's say I call a good friend of mine in Douglas, Georgia. I pick up the phone, it's on my network, it goes across my network all the way to Douglas, Georgia, and is handed off to the local carrier in Douglas, and they connect the call to the local customer on the other end. So you have to pay the local phone company to connect that part of the call. That's an access charge. People were paying, other companies were having to pay up to 6 cents per minute just for the local leg connection of a call. And considering long distance is essentially free nowadays, paying 6 cents of that local leg connection was really out of line, and we had to do something to reform those fees.
And was that only on the landline calls?
Correct.
So you never had to pay that type of access fee for your cellular?
Correct. Cellular and VoIP are not subject to those access charges, so therefore they never really saved the money from the reform. Therefore, they were never required to pay into the fund. That's why they were never required to pay into the fund. So in order to wean the rural carriers off of these access charges and bring those access charges down, this access reform part of the fund was created. And it was limited. It was limited to a portion of your access that you had lost via the reform. So over time, as I think the people from the PSC showed you a chart, that was only supposed to last for 10 years. And we're at the very end of that 10-year period. And the deal cut back in 2010 was, yes, we'll reduce our access charges, but by the way, the rural telephone companies supported the bill back in 2010, but I will only get the subsidy for 10 years out of the access fund. So it's scheduled to sunset this year. We believe it should sunset this year. The deal that everyone agreed to in 2010 has been adhered to by all parties and now should go away. Unfortunately, the problems we see with Senate Bill 65 are numerous. One, it's a completely open-ended fund. There's no limit to how much the PSC can charge companies to put money into the fund. Right now, it is limited by the lost access charges. So there is a limit today. You can't get paid back more than you lost. So there's absolutely no limit to the fund under the provisions of 65. Also, on the back end of that fund, the Public Service Commission has complete authority to dole out as much money as they want to. It's completely in their discretion with no legislative oversight whatsoever. The third thing I will mention is there's no sunset whatsoever in the bill. The sunset that's in the bill refers to the high cost portion of the bill, not the access reform part of the bill, which is being recreated as a broadband fund. So right now there is no sunset on this new broadband piece of the UAF if it were to become law. But essentially what you're doing is you would be creating an unlimited fund which would tax Georgians who use landline telephones and broadband connections. What you saw earlier from Mr. Davis's testimony is that I think there's some real legal questions as to whether you can tax internet service. The Internet Tax Freedom Act says essentially that states can't do that, nor can local governments. That's why it was passed. It was passed because some local governments around the country, fortunately none in Georgia, but some in other parts of the country, attempted to tax internet service. And Georgia has never done that. We think that's a good policy because, quite frankly, one of the challenges with broadband is not just affordability on how to get service to the customer, it's the customer's ability to afford the service. Because I can provide it to you all day long, but if it costs $400 a month, you're not going to subscribe to it. So adding surcharges onto broadband service will only make it less affordable for the end user, the consumer. So the consumer would have to pay these fees on their bill, and then at the end of the day, broadband service would be less affordable to the end user. So those are our major concerns with Senate Bill 65. We think there are better ways to go about funding rural broadband. We think the state's on the right path with appropriations. We think that's the way to go because it is generally applicable to everyone. It's not a specialized tax on a particular industry or a particular product. If broadband is so valuable to the state of Georgia, everyone should be paying in. It shouldn't be limited to a particular product. It should be part of the appropriations process, much like you've made it through the supplemental budget of $20 million, which I understand passed today. And there's another $10 million, I think, in next year's budget that the governor's put in, and he's indicated that he wants to continue to put $10 million ongoing in budgets going forward through the existing broadband fund program. So that is definitely our preference. We think these discriminatory taxes on a particular product or service are not the way to go, and simply make those products and services more expensive. So I'll be glad to answer any questions.
Okay, well, I'm going to recognize Senator Albers for a question.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. Kevin, you brought something up. I've been texting with some of our budget folks that maybe you can help clarify. You've been doing this for a long time. You mentioned legislative oversight. So I sent a couple text messages to some of our budget folks, and I asked them where this comes into the appropriation process, and they can't find it anywhere we actually appropriate this money back out. How does that work then?
No, it doesn't. It's very, I think, unique, to my knowledge, unique in state government, where this money is collected by the Public Service Commission as an agency. It doesn't go into the general fund, and then it is dispersed back out of the Public Service Commission. So it doesn't go through the general fund. It doesn't get appropriated. It avoids that entire process currently.
Are you familiar with any other executive agency that does that?
I am not.
I would question its constitutionality then.
I think people in the past have questioned the process, and I'm not an expert in that field, but I think those questions have been raised before.
Senator Lucas, I'm going to recognize you for a question here, and I may even have you sing us a little song here in a little bit. You look like you're into it today.
Kevin,
Yes, sir.
what is y'all suggesting? We've tried to do broadband, and we don't want it to take us forever to do. Telemedicine is one of the things that broadband allows folks to do and to bring services to rural Georgia. So what would be your suggestion from a company standpoint, how to expand the broadband? $20 million, $10 million, we'll be forever doing it because it's a broad spectrum. So how would you go about doing it from your standpoint?
Sure. We really fundamentally believe that the proper way to do this is through the federal programs, which have actual real money. I mean, the $326 million that were just allocated to Georgia are already being put to work via one of the announcements came earlier this week. You'll see some more that will serve 180,000 homes around the state of Georgia. So that's about 35% of the unserved people in Georgia will get service, broadband service, from that one federal fund. And there are multiple federal funds which are right now actively seeking the opportunity to give money to serve broadband customers. So we believe primarily the money is going to come from the federal government, not the state government.
Well, further, Mr. Chairman, if that's the case, and I saw the I guess it was 18 counties roll out.
Yes, sir.
But Hancock County wasn't part of it. Washington County. And when I started telemedicine, I had you and Verizon to map out the county where I had the low points and then put 5G and then enhancers on the ambulance. So how do I get it to Hancock County, one of the poorest counties in the state, when you just put something out for 18 counties?
Right, and I think, I don't have the map with me, but I did bring it last week, the map of all where the $326 million is going to be spent. Large swaths of the state, not just those 18 counties that were announced earlier this week, but I'll be glad to give you that map to see what portions of your district actually received funding in December, just 2 months ago. Yes, sir.
The song I keep thinking about is, I guess it works with Mr. Curtin and Senator Gooch, and last year Senator Gooch and Senator Kennedy, that is break up to make up. Who sang that? You know? There you go. The music chairman came through for us. Any other questions for Mr. Curtin? We got about 2 or 3 other people.
Real quick.
All righty.
How many landline customers do you have now, Kevin, in Georgia?
We don't divulge those numbers.
You don't?
No.
Isn't it true that all of your landline customers pay into this fee and you get $0 from it every year?
Correct. That is correct.
So
Yes.
is that the benefit of the other 34 ILECs out there, or the 20 actually?
Yeah. Today the only carriers that get money from the fund, and there's 2 parts of the fund, so let me be careful. Right. The access replacement part of the fund are people who reduce their access charges. We were already at a low access charge, so we never had to reduce ours. Mm-hmm. So we don't get money from the access reform portion, nor are we eligible for the high cost portion, because that's only eligible for rate of return carriers, and we're not a rate of return carrier.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thank
Mr. Hunter Hill, come on in. Well, that's what they wrote down. Maybe he doesn't know how to spell his own name. Here we go.
Sorry to disappoint.
Oh, man.
I had to talk to
We thought-
folks signing us in outside.
Well, then
I'm
we'll
sorry, I
have
got a
Hunter
good laugh
Hopkins
out
if
of
we
it,
can't
yes.
have Hunter Hill.
Yeah, thank you.
No.
Good afternoon, committee. Mr. Chairman, Hunter Hopkins with the Georgia Cable Association. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here to speak to you today. You've heard a number of concerns with Senate Bill 65. We share some of those same concerns. Thank you for the advice, Mr. Chairman. We're getting there. We're getting there. But we do have a few concerns with the bill. You heard it mentioned earlier about the possible violation of the federal internet tax law. That is a concern. I'm not an attorney, so I don't know for sure how that would stand up. Also, you heard it mentioned by a couple of the telephone providers is, you know, our landlines and some of the folks that are paying into the Universal Access Fund are, you know, those numbers are dwindling. You know, so it's a concern of putting an additional fee on a lot of these, you know, on these products that necessarily, you know, in a way, some of them are shrinking. Others, you know, if you brought broadband into it, you know, could open up new funding sources, but we just have some concerns. I do want to commend Senator Gooch for his perseverance and continued support of broadband funding, especially in rural Georgia. We really appreciate it and have enjoyed working with you over the years. You just heard, as Kevin Curtin said, there are a number of funding programs coming down from the federal government here to the state of Georgia. You know, we talked about the RDOF funds. There's stuff coming through from the USDA and some other federal programs. We don't know under the new administration up in Washington, D.C. exactly how much more additional money might be coming down. So, you know, our suggestion is to, you know, let's sit down at the table, discuss this, maybe see what other funding might be coming down the pipeline to Georgia, because there might be enough funding there, you know, to help us out and to get some of these projects done. You know, we continue to try to make investments, or my members continue to try to make investments both in served areas and unserved areas around the state. And, you know, we want to continue to try to bring broadband to every Georgia citizen, and are more than willing to sit at the table and have that discussion and, you know, and work with the proper folks, you know, to see that we get that done. But, you know, the budget, the money that the governor put in the budget, both for the amended budget that was just passed as well as the next year's budget, you know, as a start, all that's going to be doled out by Department of Community Affairs here in the next year. You know, on top of the federal funding that's coming in, we think that there's just a lot of money coming in from those sources. And if the state wants to get involved, let's you know, put some more money in through the general fund and just appropriate it straight up for you know, through the DCA or some other type of grant program versus tinkering with the Universal Access Fund. So, but with that, and due to other speakers being out in the hallway, I'll stop and answer any questions if anybody has any.
All right. Got the one question from Senator Gooch.
Would you support us repealing both of these access funds this year immediately? So we could sunset both of them on June 30th and do away with this fee that's being put on the customers' phone bills?
Senator, I'd have to go to my board and discuss that issue with them, but I just had to poll them, and I work at their direction. So it's definitely something that we can discuss if that's what you're interested in doing.
So that would help. I mean, obviously, it's not a tax to you as a company because you pass it through to the customer. Every one of your customers, including myself, we pay the fee every month. But if we went ahead and just eliminated the rest of the fee for the rest of the 10 years, that would be a tax cut to the citizens of Georgia, which we could hopefully encourage our incumbent providers to invest in broadband in their areas.
That is definitely a possibility.
And they would add that cost on to the customers at that time in their bill, right? They just raise the rates.
I don't, like I said, I work at the discretion of my board. I'd have to go back and discuss all that with them.
It could be a friendly amendment.
I'm going to recognize Senator Kennedy for a question.
Hunter, just a quick question. Who are the typical landline customers for your company now?
Typical landline customers?
Yeah.
We, honestly, to tell you the truth, I don't know.
Strikes me perhaps it's probably senior citizens and businesses. Would that encompass the majority of your?
That's what I was getting ready to get to. That
Okay.
Most of your landlines, most of the landline customers these days are older members of society as well as businesses. You're seeing, especially with the younger generation. I mean, myself included, my family, we don't have a landline at our house anymore. We just use my wife and my cell phone. So, but it's an aging society and as businesses. But as technology advances, is there even a way for some businesses to not have to have a landline? We really don't know what the future holds. It's getting, didn't they say one day we'd all just have a chip putting in our ear and, can talk with that way. So.
Thank you, Hunter.
Thank you.
All right, thanks for being with us this afternoon.
Sorry to disappoint. I'm not Hunter Hill.
You're quite good, and you're learning by the week. Let's get Terry Lindell in here.
Thank you.
That's all right. I'll get phone calls for that statement about chips planted in your head.
I think Chip Pearson could answer those questions, Mr. Whip's predecessor. Mr. Lindell, thanks for being patient, hanging with us. And Adam Wise, don't leave us out there. You're going to be heard here. We're going to wrap up in just a few minutes.
Hi, I'm Terry Lindell, and I represent Chickamauga Public Service and Ringgold Telephone Companies, and I have data for you. Chickamauga has 2,750 landlines and 1,650 broadband customers. Public Service has 4,392 landlines and 242 broadband customers, and I haven't gotten the data from Ringgold as of yet. This bill has two sections, the local exchange section and the high-speed broadband deployment section. I'm going to solely address the local exchange portion of the fund. It's also known, as Patrick Reinhardt referred to, as the high-cost fund or the Universal Access Fund. The Universal Access Fund was created to compensate telephone companies like Ringgold, Public Service, and Chickamauga Telephone Company for the differences between the actual cost to serve customers versus the rates that these customers were paying in high-cost areas. And the 1995 Telecom Act created the UAF for this purpose. Now, the UAF is administered by the Public Service Commission. Why? There's a reason. In order to receive these UAF funds, these rates, the rates of these telephone companies, have to be regulated and set by the Public Service Commission, just like Georgia Power or Atlanta Gas Light Company. AT&T's rates are not set by the Public Service Commission. There's another requirement. The second requirement is we have an obligation to serve everybody that requests service in our territory. Cable doesn't have to do that. AT&T doesn't have to do that. There's no other, they're the only providers that are under UAF and that receive this funding are obligated to serve all customers. My client's primary concern is the $35 million cap on page 7, line 158. In 2010, the General Assembly amended the 1995 statute to terminate UAF in 2030. Contributions to UAF were also allowed to implement a line item charge on bills, and it's essentially a pass-through to customers. In 2019, the Public Service Commission adopted yet another order that changed procedures for disbursements from the Universal Access Funds. Now, my clients have created business plans to serve these high-cost areas for customers after the expiration of the UAF. They've relied on a promise that this is going to end, we know it's going to end, and we're preparing to serve these customers even without UAF. It's not fair to change the rules. It is not good business practices. The Public Service Commission annually audits every application for universal access funding. And any company, such as AT&T or cable, can request that hearings be conducted before the Public Service Commission so they can examine the books. They can ensure that all of the costs that we are requesting from the Universal Access Fund are actually costs that are used to serve these customers. In fact, my 3 companies are the only companies out of all the UAF recipients that have ever had one of these hearings. We've had 2 of these hearings, and we also had a request by cable to increase our rates to our customers. And the commission found, I believe there were minimal adjustments for that on the UAF, and we were not required. It was essentially a involuntary rate case that they requested.
Ms. Lindell, were
Yes.
your rates regulated before 1995?
Yes, sir.
And that had been historically through the PSC?
Yes, sir. Now, to be just very correct and not to get into the weeds, you could provide for alternative regulation in which you set your rates and you were not regulated by the Public Service Commission. But the General Assembly requires, if you're going to receive funds from the UAF, then we've got to regulate rates. So that was the 2010 amendment. So that switched back, and there were several companies that switched from alternative regulation to rate of return regulation, and that's what my companies are under. This is a pass-through charge. Customers essentially pay this, not other providers. And we've got great service in our area. Isn't that correct, Senator Mullis? So why should we change it? Broadband's working, everything's working in these areas. So, do I have any questions?
Senator Mullis, you are not under oath, but fire away. Ask
Under
a
oath, yeah.
question.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let me say that in 2010, when this bill came through, I was the only senator who voted no, just for clarification. That's all. Even though I was instructed, I voted against them.
Senator Kennedy.
That is-
Terry, good afternoon. Thanks for
Hi.
being here.
Thank you, sir.
You were talking about how the bill is implemented and what it means for, you said, your clients and small telephone companies. Given the runway that's left, which is 10 more years,
Yes, sir.
in consulting with your clients, would it be accurate and fair to say that they are and have their business plans that rely upon the anticipation of these UAF funds for solvency for their own company, but also to ensure that the landline service that they provide to senior citizens and businesses can remain consistent and reliable for the remainder of this 10 years?
Yes, sir, that is correct.
Okay, thank you.
Yes, sir.
Senator Miller, you're recognized for a question.
Thank you, Terry, for being here. Those numbers you gave us earlier, 2,750 landline, 1,650 broadband. Where was that again?
That was Chickamauga Telephone Company.
And then the next one you gave us was 4,300 landline and 3,300 broadband?
Yes, sir.
And then did you give us another one?
I'm waiting for Ringgold. They haven't gotten back with
Okay.
me because I texted them and requested those numbers. I'll be happy to provide that to you. But these are rural areas, and as
Yeah.
you see, it's just like phone books. Years ago, remember phone books? I remember when I got a phone book when I was a little girl, I looked to see if our number was in it. AT&T doesn't provide phone books because most people in urban areas, it's not cost effective. We provide phone books because our customers demand phone books. So,
That's nice.
All right, Senator Gooch for a question, and then we have Adam Wise waiting.
Terry, I appreciate you coming, and we've talked a lot about this issue over the last couple of years, in fact. Your interest is more in the cap, the $35 million cap.
yes, sir.
And that's dealing with the 10-year plan that's still in effect for 10 more years. So that's the only change to that fund is the cap. If we eliminated the cap, does that relieve your heartburn?
My lawyer's coming out just a little bit, okay? That I want the UAF portion to stay just like it is
Okay.
without the cap. The cap is the primary
Right.
burn, so.
The-
But there are other provisions.
Really, the meat of the bill is about the other fund, not your.
Yeah, yes,
portion that
sir.
you're
I
concerned
agree.
about. But you have no opposition to the other portion in the bill.
No, sir.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank
Mr. Adam Wise, come on in, our last speaker, and we're going to get us out of here by 5 o'clock. Don't tell them what time it is.
Hello, happy to answer any questions here. Always happy to be here, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Adam Wise with the Georgia Telecommunications Association. I will be brief. The GTA represents 18 of the 19 UAF recipients in the high-cost portion, and we have a few of our members that receive the Access Transition Fund portion, but that's going away, as you've heard, at the end of this year, or June 30th. Similar to other telecom representatives here today, we oppose SB 65 for several reasons. Some of them have been covered, and I'll be brief about those, but we specifically oppose the cap on the high-cost portion of the fund. When this was instituted, you have your rural telephone companies are carriers of last resort. They're required to serve if you request a landline, as you heard Mr. Reinhardt from PSC say. So if the little old lady on the mountain requests us, we have to build out no matter what the cost is. And this UAF, it reimburses those costs so she can get service. So if she doesn't have a cell phone service up there, she can call out 911 if she needs help, and that's what we're doing. But if you limit this fund, right now, two things are going to happen. One, we might not be able to maintain these lines as we have, and the service is going to degrade, and that little old lady on the mountain will not be able to call 911. Or we'll have to offset those losses with other revenue. And then most likely that's going to come from broadband, and we're not going to be able to expand broadband and continue to offer the same exceptional service that we have to this day. And the third issue with that, it may be a constitutional issue with the taking, as we're required to serve. If we're not reimbursed, that may be a taking issue that would violate the Constitution. In regards to the grant program, you've heard a lot of the issues that have come up, and we have a lot of the same issues. There's no duration for how long it will last, what the contribution amount will be required by the commission, the price increases on the customers, whether it's illegal or not under the Internet Freedom Tax Act. And finally, you may have providers who are coming in who you don't know that are just setting up shop to get this funding, and they may not be able to provide quality service, and then the state and the customers all lose out. So that kind of wraps it up in a nutshell for you real quick. Happy to answer any questions you may have.
Senator Brass, recognize you for a question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, Adam, you had mentioned the little old lady couldn't get 911 services. Is that type of service not covered under that 911 fee that we charge, that $1.50 we hit on every landline, every wireless, every voice-activated thing?
That goes to your public service answering points. It goes to the GMA, it goes to 911. It does not necessarily go to the phone company. We charge that cost, and we receive a percentage of that just to operate as the tax collector. But it does not go to the phone lines itself.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions? All right, thank you so much for being here. Everybody have a great weekend. Next week's schedule, we anticipate we will be hearing from Senator Beach on parimutuel horse racing and his constitutional amendment to support that on Tuesday. And we will be hearing from Senator Mullis and his bill on sports betting next Thursday. Please line up your testimony, and we'll have those notices out. That's Subject to change, but it's certainly what we anticipate.
Yes, folks.
Everybody have a great weekend. Don't forget it's Valentine's Day on Sunday.